Have you ever wondered what the Enigma Machine was all about and why it still matters today? Well, as it turns out, it's my favorite topic. I'm excited to welcome Mark Sachs to today's podcast. Mark is one of the world's experts on what was arguably the most important and famous encryption device in history. Here's one of these devices, and we're going to walk you through it today, how it worked. It looked a little bit like a typewriter, what role these rotors played, why it seemed unbreakable, and why it wasn't. Welcome to the show. It's my pleasure to welcome Mark Sachs today. Mark is the Senior Vice President and Chief Engineer at the Center for Internet Security in Clifton Park, New York. Welcome to the show, Mark.
Thank you, Peter. Good morning, good afternoon.
Maybe it's more important for this podcast even that you are one of the foremost experts on the Enigma Machine. So that's what we're gonna talk about today.
Oh, okay. Our favorite subject, right?
Our favorite subject. So let's start from scratch. What's the Enigma Machine, and why does it still matter today?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting mechanical device. So if we just go back in history a bit, the challenge has always been, how do I send a secure message, from one person to another? And often we say it's from Alice to Bob, A to B. So it works out pretty good. Those are your characters. There's an eavesdropper known as Eve who would be part of this character set also. So how does Alice send a message to Bob in a way that Eve can't intercept it? Or if Eve intercepts it, can't understand it? Now, this problem goes back thousands of years, with communications between kingdoms and military units and so forth. So different ways were invented. And everything was fine up until, say, the middle 1800s, when this new device called the telegraph came along. And up till that point, creating an encrypted message, even though it was done by hand, didn't take very long compared to the time it took to move the message. So the speed of the message was based on the speed of a horse or a fast ship. Well, now with telegraph, that changed things because it was faster to transmit the message and slower to encipher the message. So in the 1800s, thinking was put into, okay, how do I mechanically correct this? Are there ways that I can make encipherment faster? And so by the end of the 1800s, when we had this big explosion of technology, in addition to the telegraph, along comes the telephone. Later, the radio gets invented, around 1900 or so. Typewriters were invented, lots of new technologies, late 1800s, early 1900s. And this all came together really in World War I, because now you had airplanes as a whole nother way of moving information very, very fast. So a number of inventors, 1917, 1918, 1919, began thinking about this problem and looking at the typewriter, which was an invention that people were already using. Could I just simply type out the message? And as I'm typing the message, its output would automatically be encrypted. And so one of these inventors, Arthur Scherbius, who was from Germany, his machine, which he called the Enigma, eventually became the big winner. There were several others that worked the same way. But his machine popularized in the 1920s for businesses. So while it's made in Germany, it was sold internationally, even here in America. A lot of businesses were using the Enigma machine of the 1920s. Fairly simple principle. You have 26 keys, one for each letter of the alphabet. There's no numbers. There's no space bar. There's no comma, period, other things. Just very simple in its operation, 26 keys. And each key essentially is a switch. So when you push down the key, it completes a circuit. And there's a battery inside, or you can connect it to external power supply at very low voltage, 4.5 volts. And by pushing down the key, you complete a circuit and a light bulb illuminates. And the light bulb is your enciphered letters. So if I hold down K, for example, the J light bulb might light up. Now, the way this worked was kind of novel. Inside the machine, in addition to the switches underneath the keys, there was a set of rotors. And mechanically, when I pushed down on the key, it would advance the first rotor by one notch. Now, each rotor had 26 pins on each side, and it completes a circuit. So I have 3 of them in a row. Electricity going from the battery to the key to the first rotor, the second rotor, the third rotor. Hits what's called a reflector. And each time I go through a rotor or a reflector, I'm changing the letter back through the 3 rotors, back to the light panel. So now I have several substitutions, essentially, of letters. Mathematically, you can do the math. It's 26 times 26 times 26 possibilities, 17,000 some odd possibilities. And, for the 1920s, not bad. Later inventions said, okay, I can change the way the rotor makes, or the way it works. So not just the 26 original settings, but I can rotate the ring and add some more scrambling to it. In the 1930s, when the Nazis came to power, they were also looking for a way to rapidly encipher messages. And they said, let's take this Enigma machine. We'll add another feature to it called the plug board on the front instead of plugs, the Stecker board. And so I could then add another substitution. In the end, you wind up with an enormous amount of possibilities, the key space, as we like to call it, larger than the number of atoms in the universe. I mean, just an incredibly large number of possible combinations. And of course, the Germans thought nobody can crack this. This is mathematically impossible to do so. But that's where the Allies found themselves in the early 1930s. The Enigma machine was well known, again, being used for business and other purposes. So they fundamentally understood how it worked. But the actual wiring of it and this plug board on the front and other features remained a mystery until several were captured, some key sheets were captured. And largely this was led by Polish intelligence early in the 1930s, beginning to figure out exactly how this machine works and how to reverse engineer the key. So that sets up the story, leading into World War II. So let's go from there. That's kind of the background on the Enigma.
Yeah, actually, I have a couple of things in front of me here. There's one of these wheels you mentioned, or rotors. Typically call it rotors, right? And then
rotor is correct.
If you sort of pull this apart, it's going to look inside, sort of what I have in front of me with a bunch of wires. And you mentioned the 26 contacts on one side, get wired over to the other side of 26 contacts. It sort of scrambles it for each rotor. And then the rotors are different. But was the Enigma machine the only rotor machine for encryption at the time, or did the Japanese or others also use similar things?
Others use the same. So again, back to the end of World War I, several rotor machines were invented. The Enigma is the one that's the most famous, but there were others. Hayburn had a machine. And the Japanese, you mentioned that, they had a similar. Actually, the Enigma company made some Enigma-like machines for the Japanese Imperial Army to use. They were wired differently, but they functionally work the same. And many other brands. But of course, the Enigma is the one that's the most popular, but not the only one. Even in the German military, the Enigma was the one that was used most popularly on the battlefield, the Army and the Air Force and the Navy. But the High Command, the German High Command, other organizations use different types of rotor machines that have different names, but Enigma being the one that's most popular, that people have heard of.
And any of these machines, whether German machines or Japanese, etc., did some of them remain unbroken during the war? In other words, secure?
That's a hard question because some of this is still classified today.
Okay.
I think a reasonable person would say, yes, all were broken, but how they were broken, the intelligence taken from that, even the Americans, we had rotor-based machines, same principle. Ours had a larger number of contacts, 30 plus contacts in some case. The British had rotor-based machines, also built differently. Did the Germans crack the American and British machines? Possibly. I would say, again, a reasonable man would say yes, but that knowledge still remains classified. The Russians, by the way, did not like the Enigma machines. They didn't trust the Germans one little bit. And so they were developing their own. And even into the Cold War, rotor-based machines used by the Soviet Union were in use until the early 90s, the fall of the Soviet Union. So they were still using those machines that were drastically improved, motors inside of them, able to connect to external devices, teletype machines, and so forth. The Enigma had no external connections. It could not print. You could not connect it to a teletype. It just simply took two operators, one to type in a message, one to read the light bulb output on the other side. Yeah. The Soviet machines were very ingenious and again in use until the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s.
And you said, in principle, at least the most advanced Enigma machines towards the end of the war you could, let's call them, build them and set them up in a number of combinations larger than the atoms in the universe, the number of atoms in the known universe. Let's say, okay, sure, something like 10 to the 100 or whatever this number is.
Yeah,
But
large. Yeah, 3 times
huge,
10 to the 105
or
or whatever the
something
number
rather.
was. Very, very large number. Yeah.
Okay, but however, once you capture a machine, that brings that number down to something more like 10 to the 23 or something, which is enormous still, but much less. However,
That, yeah, that's correct. I mean, there is the theoretical key space.
Right.
If you actually do the math, the possible combinations of rotors, settings, the plug board, et cetera, that theoretical number is very, very large.
Yes.
Then there's the practical key space. When you take into account all the different settings that we had to use, the shortcuts that were taken, user instructions, and yes, the number you get down to, if you put it into today's terms, it'd be about like DES, the digital encryption standard, roughly.
Okay.
But still, still pretty good for the 1940s. Yes. I have to hand it to them. It was a remarkable machine for its time. Today, your cell phone, your iPhone, or your Android can crack an Enigma machine. It has the computing power to do that today, but obviously that was not around back in the 1940s.
Okay, so in the Enigma, like maybe all things, any encryption device, arguably you should always design it so if the algorithm may be known to the enemy, meaning the machine can fall into the enemy's hands, but as long as you don't have the key, one of these many, many keys you can choose, the starting positions, if you like, where you start off the machine and encrypt, as long as you don't have much, almost nothing. That's always the idea, Mark, isn't it? To this day?
Yeah, so if you want to crack the message, if you actually want to read the message, you have to recover the key. That's the best way to do it. Otherwise, it's a brute force guessing attempt. Now, by the way, that's what the Polish did. They perfected it on the earlier versions, but before they became complicated, they did work out the math that you could actually use to crack the machines. It was very, very tedious hand principle. But there's another part to this, and that's traffic analysis. For example, the Germans use different networks. This is all done on Morse code over the radio. And so there was network discipline. You can't all transmit at the same time. So you had a network controller who would, say, okay, you may now send your message. Well, the Allies are listening in on all this. And even if they couldn't crack the message, they could still understand that this unit was talking to that unit, or a series of units were communicating with each other. And you could see the up and down motion of messages prior to troop movements or prior to an assault, or if you're moving back from the battlefield. So there was even techniques for pulling intelligence from Enigma messages without reading the message. This is a very important thing to understand, is you don't always have to crack the encryption to begin to learn what the adversary is up to just by studying how they're communicating and the time of day and the frequency and so forth.
So then when you said the Germans thought it was secure throughout the war, and well, we learned, of course, in the end that it wasn't, the communication with the Enigma machine, that is. So the code was broken first by Bletchley Park in England, right? And this would have shown on the battlefield, I'm assuming, or in the oceans. And were there not indications where the Germans realistically should have looked at the situation, how it changed, and thought, well, someone's knowing something now. So why did they not follow that thought?
So there had been suspicion. So again, the original Enigma, 3 rotors, and it came with 3 rotors. In 1938, roughly, the decision was made to move to 5 rotors. You picked 3 out of the 5. So that made it harder for the Allies. You don't know which of the 3. And of course, they can be in a different order. The Navy in 1940, 41, the Kriegsmarine decided that, okay, 3 rotors is not enough. I need to move to 4. I need to add another level of complexity here. Largely because they suspected something was going on. They're thinking that the Allies might be reading their messages. So they moved to a more complex machine. The problem with that, though, for all of us who've studied this, the more complex you make something, the more likely it is to make mistakes. And so even with the 4-rotor Navy machine, in order for them to communicate with the Army or the Air Force, they had to set their 4th rotor in somewhat of a neutral position. So they might use the first 3 rotors to send a message to an Army unit or an Air Force unit. Then they would adjust the 4th rotor to send a message to a naval unit. But we had already recovered the message using 3 rotors. So then it was really just one of 26 settings, to recover the setting of the fourth rotor. So these are operational mistakes that we, the Allies, had figured out. But to your point, the Germans, they thought that this was uncrackable, unsolvable. The Allies made a very big effort. If they pulled intelligence from an Enigma transmission and they want to act on that intelligence, to make it look like it was some other tool, some other technique, some other way that they recovered that intelligence so as not to betray the fact that its source was from Enigma cracked messages.
Like planes flying over the ocean, spotting U-boats all of a sudden, and after which they got sunk, and the plane was the first one to spot them rather than Enigma, that sort of thing, I guess.
That's right. Well, they had been discovered, of course, by studying encrypted traffic, so the Allies knew where they were. But then you'd fly a plane low over the top of a submarine, and the captain of the sub would believe, oh, I've been discovered by this low-flying airplane.
Right.
Or maybe I've been discovered by sonar or radar or some other technology, not by the Enigma machine or not by studying the enciphered traffic.
So speaking of mistakes the Germans made, let's go through some of them. I mean, can you list a few that I think they're all rather extraordinary in hindsight?
Yeah, they are. A lot of them were operational mistakes. So again, complexity leads to mistake making. So think in terms of a battlefield soldier, somebody who's running the Enigma machine, probably 18, 19, 20 years old, young man, not women, but young men. They're on the battlefield. They would rather be at home. They'd rather be with their mates. They'd rather be having dinner with mom and dad. It's the last place they want to be is on the battlefield. So they're going to take shortcuts. They're going to make mistakes. And this comes down to discipline. So if you're using encryption anywhere, and some of these lessons can really be brought forward to present day, there has to be discipline in how you use it. You can't let the users just make up their own rules. So the actual way this worked, you had a code sheet that you worked off of that gave you the settings for the day. But then you had to make sure that the other recipient, knew which code sheet you're on, knew what your settings were. So there was a procedure where you would take 3 letters in the clear and you'd encipher them twice using the rotor settings, and the header of the message would contain that information in the clear. Now, the operators, being in their late teens, early 20s, they might use the first 3 letters of their girlfriend's name. They might use HIT, the first 3 letters of Hitler, or other letters, and they would use them repeatedly, same letters over and over and over every day. Again, the Allies studying this, they knew this particular operator. They didn't know what the operator's name was, but they knew it was the same operator, always used these 3 initials for key settings. Other operators would always use the same. So those type of user errors was a fundamental mistake that gave the Allies an advantage. The code sheets themselves, they changed every night at midnight. Everybody on the battlefield would change the key settings. Well, what that gave the Allies was if you were able to recover a key setting a few minutes after midnight, you're good for the next 24 hours. Nothing's going to change. Or if it took you 23 hours, it's almost 11 p.m., and you finally recover the key settings. Well, now all the messages that were sent that day, you can go back and reread them. And so that 24-hour cycle was a bit of a problem. We can bring that to present day. Your key rotation should be fairly rapid and certainly should not be predictable. We knew they would change keys at midnight, German time. And so we knew with regularity that there was going to be a change in messages. They would make other simple mistakes, like a message would be written down on paper, handed to the operator just a few minutes before midnight. Operator would use that day's settings. By the time the message is transmitted, it's the next day. And now the machine operator on the other end can't decipher it because he's already changed his settings to the new day settings. Message goes back. Hey, I can't read your message. Oh, okay, let me retransmit it using the new settings. Well, now you have possibly the message had already been cracked using the old settings. Now we know what the new settings look like because I can do what's called a plain text attack. So again, these are operational errors. And we see this play out today in 2026 when people are using encryption, not following rules, making things up, trying to take shortcuts. They get themselves in trouble.
Yeah, I want to talk about this a little bit, actually. So the lessons learned from these operational mistakes that the Germans made, and in other systems at the time, perhaps. So some of them carry over to, you just said it basically, but what would these be? So for someone like you to advise people, right, and how, on trying to make systems as secure as possible. So what are some of the key messages you would give?
Yeah. Well, I think number one is don't try and invent your own encryption system.
Okay.
I've seen this in my career, even back to the mid 90s when I was in the military in uniform. I would have companies coming to me with their proprietary system. It's so strong, even the government can't crack it. And it's nuts to do that. Here in the United States, NIST and the NSA, that's the authority on encryption standards. They're all well published. It goes back to what you were saying earlier. The actual mechanism of the encryption, the algorithm, or in the mechanical world, the fact that you used rotors, how the rotors are wired, none of that is a secret. That's all out in the open. Today, it's math formulas, but they're all out in the open. If you try and create your own math formula, you think you're smarter than these people who are, professional cryptographers, it's going to get you into trouble because it can be cracked. So, rule number one, don't use your own, use a well-published one. Now, we're running into a problem. It's a little off topic here, but it's this quantum computer issue. So you remember I mentioned earlier that there was no computer in the 1940s that could crack the Enigma, but today iPhones, Androids, laptop computers can crack it rather regularly. Well, coming, the next level of computing is quantum computing. We don't have one yet that can do this, but the theory is pretty sound that today's algorithms will be not a whole lot different than the algorithms of the 40s that can be cracked by iPhones today. So today's algorithms can be easily cracked by a quantum machine some 15, 20 years down the road. So we have to be thinking in terms of what the government's calling quantum safe algorithms. And what are we doing to take an inventory of all the systems we have in our operation, in the plant, in our business, and across the organization? Are they forward-looking quantum safe? Now, most people have no idea what we're talking about, but there's plenty of information out there to look into it, to learn what this means. So that probably the choice of the algorithm, making sure it's well published, well understood. Is it forward safe? Will new computers not be able to crack it? And it does require, if you're a computer security professional, you do need to understand the different types of encryption. There's symmetric versus asymmetric, for example. Quantum computers, once they get here, are going to be really good at cracking asymmetric. That's the public-private key pair. They'll be able to pretty much determine which the key pairs are. Symmetric encryption, on the other hand, it's just a matter of making the key longer. Now, that was the Enigma machine. That was a symmetric encryption machine. So longer key lengths and the proper discipline, we could still be using rotor machines today if they had not been replaced by electronic machines, because it's very, very hard to crack a symmetric algorithm because you just simply make the keys longer and longer key sets. So it would require more and more computing time.
So by symmetric, you mean for the Enigma, right? It's an example you said of symmetric encryption. So it means when I encrypt a message, a text, it maps it onto an encrypted text. In order to decrypt, I set up the machine exactly the same way originally with the same key.
Same way. That's correct.
And asymmetric would be, you use one key to encrypt and a different key to decrypt, I guess. It sounds rather surprising, right? You would think that inherently a non-symmetric should be harder, but now you're telling me a symmetric might be harder for quantum.
Well,
That's quite
and it's because of the mathematics behind it. And so the math is easier. There are new algorithms that have been invented but it takes a quantum computer to run them, that can now essentially brute force your public-private key pair. So your little model that you have there in front of you, it's a very good one that shows kind of the separation of the parts inside an Enigma machine. Of course, you had the three rotors, but the end was a reflector, turn the electricity around, right? And that reflector is what made it symmetric. So you wind up with a pair. For every time you press a key, there's a matching pair. So if I hold down the M key, for example, the O light bulb might light up. Well, without moving into the rotors, if I were to press down the O key, the M light bulb will light up. So you have this symmetric pairing between letters. So essentially 13 pairs of letters. Now that might sound like a problem, but again, I can add more rotors. I can add more complexity to the machine, making it very, very hard. The Swiss, by the way, by the late 1940s, early 50s, they had 10 rotor machines. They were really into making these keys much longer because they understood that you just make the keys longer and it makes it nearly impossible to crack.
It's also for the Enigma is that no letter can, by the same principle, no letter get mapped onto itself, right? So let's take the German language. The most common letter is the letter E. We say A in German, but it's E in English anyways, right? Well, that has the highest frequency in the original text, but then not once once you type the E, it doesn't get mapped to another E. So take that out, of course.
Right.
So Mark, to understand, that was a weakness, right, of the machine. Is that correct?
Yeah, and the reason that was a weakness, if I had a bunch of ciphertext, a string of letters, and I had somewhat of a guess as to what I think it might mean, and I write down that guess underneath it. Well, if the letter M in my guess lines up with the letter M of the ciphertext, I know that cannot be. Mechanically, I could never have that. No letter will ever encipher to itself. So for shorter messages, this was a weakness. It was an engineering weakness because of that reflector. And we're not saying don't use the reflector. It was just another of many knives in the drawer that the Allies used when trying to crack an Enigma message. No one method was the only thing in use. They had several tools at their disposal for cracking these messages.
So one thing that strikes me about the sort of the history of cryptography, if you like, is that you start off, you said, with letters in the old days. 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, hundreds of years ago, we wrote sort of encrypted letters. And as you said, traveling took much longer than making the effort of encrypting them, so it was worthwhile, the effort. So then we talked about the Enigma machine, which is electromechanical. Okay, so that's progressing, if you want. And we then built, well, the first computers to break some of these rotor machines. Okay, so then we enter the modern computer age, where we then used digital, basically it's a digital world then for encryption, and now we move into quantum, I guess. Is that finally the end of the line, or what could possibly come after? I'm a physicist. I don't see anything else after that, but do you? This is all we have, right?
We don't know.
We don't know, okay.
Right, well, we don't know, because enter the age of artificial intelligence.
Good point.
This is an interesting development. We've had AI, or the term's been around for a long time, machine learning and so forth, and there's been a lot of work leading up to where we are today with large language models and the ability to predict things. Now, nobody's been able, as far as I know, to take a large language model and use it to reverse engineer a crypto key. But who's to know that might not happen? There's a lot of things are rapidly changing in the AI world. As we learn better how to use these new math formulas, better ways to use microprocessors and GPUs and so forth. So who's to say? What all a quantum computer does is it simulates the natural world around us. If you're a physicist, you know that we have Newtonian physics. That's what we've always believed was true. And then you have quantum physics, which comes along and says, no, there's a different truth that's out there. This is really how it works. Well, I don't know, but what there may be something even after quantum physics that might be a better explanation of the world around us. But what I do know is that AI is now empowering essentially what we've been doing as humans, where we're beginning to understand the world around us and make a hypothesis, test it, and see if it works. With AI, I can come up with a hypothesis and test it in milliseconds. I don't have to wait years to do lots of experiments and so forth. So could we possibly be using AI to help us figure out a new physics that's out there, be predictable? Maybe. Today we can't do it. AI doesn't work that way, but the future of it might bring that to us. All I know is that the future will be very unlike the world it is today, and technology will keep changing. You're probably aware that late 1800s, that explosion of technology, there were some people suggesting that we can close down the patent office because everything that could possibly be invented has been invented. And, we know, obviously, 125 years later, that's not the case. Inventions just keep on rolling. So imagining that quantum is the end of the line, that would be like somebody saying that there's nothing after telegraph. We've invented everything. We now have high-speed communications.
Yeah, it's a good point. So I think AI has been surprising many mathematicians recently, and pure mathematicians, okay? Hardcore mathematicians, meaning that maybe until a year and a half ago, Most mathematicians believe that AI will not have any time soon a huge impact on proving theorems, maybe coming up with new hypotheses, right? So then it started off by reproving existing theorems, but sometimes in a more elegant fashion, right? Maybe more condensed or
That's right.
et cetera, et cetera. So
That's
the
exactly right.
mathematicians are
And
slowly
I
coming
might,
around.
train a large language. Yeah, I might train a large language model on every known mathematical theory and say, okay, now going all the way back to the Greeks and say, okay, based on that training, what am I missing? How do I factor a large number into its primes?
Right.
How do I solve equations that otherwise I couldn't? So there's always been in mathematics these unsolvable math problems.
Yeah.
Could AI help get us closer? Well, that's always possible, right?
My gut feeling tells me yes, because what we do in encryption, we're mapping an original information, right, onto another piece of information, okay, that no one can arguably read except my ally. So, but we're mapping A to B, or not the A to B you mentioned at the beginning, X to Y, let's say, okay. It's a mathematical mapping of some sorts. Well, large language models are just entirely based on mathematical operations. So intuitively, I would say it lends itself. There will probably be some progress. I would not be surprised, actually. But mathematicians
I
were
would hope
surprised.
so. And maybe even bringing quantum and AI together. We're in a quantum computer. The theory, as you know, as a physicist, is that we can have all the states simultaneously versus having to go from one state to another state to another state. It blows your mind if you're, for most of us who live in a Newtonian mindset, the concept of having every possible state happening at exactly the same time, it's crazy. But given that, and given what we've been doing in AI, if you bring the two together, do we now derive a third new phenomenon that comes from that? I would imagine so. Come back in 15, 20 years, and I think we'll be very surprised with what's happened with computer science.
We'll have another podcast then, you and I, and let's talk about it then.
That's right.
Well, this is great. So, as a last question, what piece of advice would you give anyone when it comes to avoiding operational errors when you want to communicate securely? This could be the person on the street.
Yeah, the clear thing, the person on the street needs to make sure that the devices you're using are always updated. So software is always changing. And encryption algorithms are no different than, which web browser you're using or which phone you're using. So if your machine is more than a few years old, it's already out of date, unfortunately. So the person on the street, absolutely stay up to date. The other piece of this, of course, is that privacy is very, very hard today. And so we largely use encryption thinking that that's going to keep things private. And we teach people to do that. Make sure that the little lock shows up when you're web browsing. Make sure you use two-factor or multi-factor authentication and biometric. We don't always have to do that. If I'm just sending a message to my friend or something, if it's not encrypted, not a big deal. But if I'm doing a bank transaction, I certainly want to make sure that I've got some encryption turned on. But if I share my password with other people, or I share, my phone with others, or I use a type of multi-factor authentication that's fairly weak, all this work that I'm doing to protect myself goes nowhere. And then there's also the trust of other people. We see this happen all the time. I might have a great relationship with my hospital. I believe that all my medical records are absolutely secure, but that hospital keeps the records someplace else, cloud server, whatever. Well, that's way beyond my control. And that information could get breached and then used against me. So in this world that we are in, we have to understand there really the concept of total privacy is almost gone. And we have to recognize what impact that will have on us in society, and what you're working with may not be truthful. We have bad actors that increasingly are using AI and using other tools to create a fake world around us, a fictitious world that our human minds love to believe, but it's not true. And this goes back again to the lessons learned with the Germans. At the end of World War II, Nuremberg trials, the admirals, generals, others were asked, why did the Allies win the war? What mistakes were made? Nowhere during that testimony did anybody say, we think you were reading our messages, or we believe that the encryption was cracked. That little fact led the Allies to understand we can continue cracking these machines. And we encouraged the new German government, the Dutch government, the Belgian government, others, please keep using the Enigmas. They're impossible to crack. Nobody has solved it. It's perfect for your embassy communications. And of course, all along, we're cracking it. Now,
Yes.
that same phenomenon can happen today where somebody says, please keep using this. It's wonderful. It works great. And they're encouraging you to use it because they know already how to get through it. And they just want you to believe that it's perfectly safe. So it's a crazy world we live in, but that is the world around us.
So probably the moment I think I'm complacent, I'm probably complacent, and I shouldn't be. So
That's right.
That's the main message. Well, thank you, Mark. It was a fantastic conversation. Thank you for all your insights.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's always fun to talk about and fun to find another person who liked it. I love your little model, that explosion of the rotor there. That is a perfect thing for training people and showing how these machines work, taking away the mystery of the Enigma machine.
Yeah, thank you for joining us today. Thank you.
Peter.
Have a good day.